This is Calvin Castine, and today we are turning the tables here on our little corner. Our subject today is Mr. Gordie Little.
Turning the table. I've said all along that you should get on the camera, and now you are, and everybody knows you're taller and much better looking and 25 years younger, and this whole program is down in the toilet now, starting right at this moment.
That's right. Gordie will now be running the camera, and I will...
No, we know somebody else running the camera today. It's Judy Castine. She's done that before, and she started right off by sticking her tongue out at us and saying, "This thing's on manual. How do we make it work?"
That's right, and you've never seen me stick my tongue out at you when you're on this side of the camera, have you?
She tried to focus on my nose, and that was a big mistake right off the bat.
Said she couldn't fit it all in the lens.
Oh, I love it. Welcome to our home in Morrisonville on the Saranac River. Lots of people who've watched this program have heard us talk about it, and you've been here a couple of times before. Judy, have you ever been here? Yeah, maybe one time before. We had a delicious weekend.
Yeah, we're taping this.
Judy and my wife Kay and you and I were taping this right near the end of 1998 on the 30th day of December. But a few months ago we went over to Stowe. And we had didn't we have a terrific time up there?
How can you do anything other than have a terrific time in Stowe? At the Von Trapp Family Lodge?
Oh, Kay's in there busily trying to find the photographs because Judy had a little trouble with her pictures and maybe a couple of them double exposed, but I think photographs should have been invented that way so you can look at 3 or 4 subjects.
She thought it was 3D, I think. I hope she doesn't double expose this show right here.
What kind of a year has it been for you?
It's been hectic and busy.
Why am I asking you the question?
I don't know. It's been
a great year for both of us. We've had so much fun. I don't know how many interviews we've done and places we've visited, but our little corner has actually spread itself quite a bit around the North Country, hasn't it, huh?
Yeah, and on the way down here, I was trying to think of which show I enjoyed doing the most. We had such great experiences in Tupper Lake, Elizabethtown, and Stowe. We've had some good shows, and some closer to home besides.
You know what
right
it
here
is?
In Schuyler Falls, in fact.
That's true, too. We had a wonderful day during the parade for their big historical celebration. History seems to be a theme that is threaded through the subject matter of almost all of our programs. And one way or the other, we find the historical things.
Well, if it's not history, it becomes history years from now, whatever we're doing, and that's the way I've tried to look at it.
I suppose that's why we're here today. This is a little bit of history because you and I are so passionate about people and places in the North Country and the history, Who lived in that house 120 years ago? How many times have we gone walking through people's backyards to see if a stone pile was really an old well or whatever? But isn't it fun?
Yeah, yep. And, and I think out of all those things we've done this year, you mentioned history. I think we were part of history on September 11th, and that would probably have to stand out in my mind.
If you were going to look back and talk about one of the most important historical events, not only here in the Plattsburgh and Clinton County area, but for Clinton County, it would be the Battle of Plattsburgh and the War of 1812, and part of our effort, and many other people who have a lot more influence in the world than you and I do are working toward that 200th anniversary in the year 2014. And when we helped to raise I say help because we were there chawing about it, when they raised that confiance anchor in Lake Champlain and made a big to-do out of it on the morning of September 11th, 1998. You're right. That was history because I saw the Christmas card from Frank Pabst, and you're in it.
Yeah, and so is Santa Claus or something.
Not me.
Yeah, and I've learned that it's probably called the confiance, too. That we learned a new word. We talked to...
tomato, and I say tomato, confiance, confiance. As long as we pronounce the names right. We found out a few of the names we may have been pronouncing wrong for almost 200 years, but,
Yes, well, I think it's anglicized when we were talking.
Prevost and Prevost.
When we, Mr. or Lord Prevost or
Yeah.
whatever. We would always say Prevost, and he's the one who says confiance instead of confiance. But
Hey, when he's standing next to me, I do whatever he wants me to do. But weren't those wonderful people, the descendants of the McDonoughs and Prevost and all the other folks whose ancestors were part of it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a delicious moment for all of us.
Yep, and even, no matter, I know next year there's talk of Cannon coming up and so on, but it'd be hard to top this year with the anchor raising.
You and I have already promised to keep ourselves in shape if we can for when some of these dreams are fulfilled out there at the old base and the barracks, and I want to see a full-size replica of the Saratoga anchored right where it might have been at some point in its career back during the War of 1812. Wouldn't that be amazing?
Yeah, and I think it's going to happen. I think Chris Ortloff and the band he has assembled is going to make it happen.
Well, we enjoy talking about history, covering it by way of video. I did it for many years on the radio, but now we got pictures attached to it, and as I've said so many times, your library of videotapes since 1980 what?
I started in June 11th, 1983 was the first time that programming was on in Clinton County from the local area outside of it, something the college may have done. And the first voice that the people heard was a fellow named Gordie Little introducing Our Hour was the name of our show.
Was it Our Hour?
Our Hour.
Oh, isn't that neat? Yeah. 1984.
83.
So 83.
83.
So you got a lot of tapes. That should be licensed by the Library of Congress and part of the Smithsonian and the whole 9 yards.
I started Hometown Cable in April of '86. Is Kay going to answer that phone if we keep talking?
Well, I imagine she'll. The dog's barking to get out of the river room. Well, people know who the river room is, who know me. And Kay's answering the phone, but this is off the wall. This is the way we do this show.
That's
we
right.
don't edit it. Whatever sounds we make that we didn't intend to, they're on the tape.
They become part of history.
You got it.
Let's get back to the original starting of local television in the Clinton County area. When cable came to Champlain, I was kind of excited to learn there was going to be an access channel, and I thought it'd be a good project for the Woodmen of the World that I was involved with, and still am involved with. So we put the gears into place to start a show, and there was going to be a weekly hour-long program, and I thought we'd call it Hour, H-O-U-R.
Just keep talking. I'm going to let him out.
All right, Gordie's going to let the dog out. So the first place I headed for when I needed somebody to introduce the show, I went to a Woodmen of the World member in Morrisonville named Gordie Little, and Gordie said, "Yeah, I'd love to do that for you." And I can't remember the exact words, but it's quite similar to the introduction we used for Our Little Corner. I stole some of that for Our Little Corner when we started this show here.
You and I feel very strongly about public access, and we hope to do so much more in 1999 than we've done in 1988, because it's not just something that we do to satisfy our egos. It's something we do to satisfy a great need in the North Country. We've looked at public access channels around the countryside, and many times they're misused. But it's good to have the availability there.
I've told this story when the man from the Cable Commission, Tom Isabella, was in Plattsburgh. I'm not sure if it was him or one of his staff. This was 4 or 5 years ago. He was talking about possible misuse. I don't want to allege misuse of public access. There was one town in the state of New York where a man would sit there for half an hour and cut his toenails, and he wanted to put that on public access. So
I didn't hear that story before.
So they just weren't quite sure that was necessary to be on there, but that's an example of what I would call misuse, but this guy here thought was artistic expression, I guess.
Well, you know what the kinds of things are on the internet, on the computer now, you know.
That's kind of scary.
But anyway, we've always felt as though there are a lot of people who deserve to be told about how many wonderful characters, and I use that term with love and great love and affection. How many wonderful characters have we interviewed? How many more did Bob Venn and Calvin Castine go to see before I even got involved? So we have such delightful people who live. Not only do we have a great countryside, you're going to get me on my soapbox again. We have a great place to live. Kay and I just talking about this the other day, how we could never leave the banks of the Saranac River. We love it here. We love our community just as you love your community. But the people here in northern New York are more special, I believe, than in many other places I've ever visited. And we've proved that, I think.
And unfortunately, Mother Nature has helped us to prove that over the last several years with floods and the ice storm and one disaster after another. And, and people come through for each other.
Yeah, they have. These are subjects that we can't emphasize too often, I think. The newspaper does a wonderful job. All the other media do too, but that's what helps people bring it together. You say, Joe Blow is the fire chief in Moores. Look what the Moores Fire Station did. Look what the Rouse's Point people did. Look what the Shazy people did. Look what the Osable Forks, I don't want to leave anybody out, but the fire departments alone helped so many people during that ice storm. And we're only a little over a week away from that anniversary, and that's not one that I really want to dwell on because, we saw on the news over the last few days down south, it was Virginia's turn. And it was some of the southern states. Washington, D.C. was nailed. There are people who, wow, I heard on the news this morning they haven't had power for 5 days. Does that sound familiar to you, Calvin?
Yes. Fortunately for them, I hope their weather is a little milder right now than what we experienced. And, of course, we were fortunate that we didn't get our drastically cold weather like we are about to experience today during that period. But, it's so many people came through, and you just can't do justice for the effort that those people did. But we're not here to talk about those disasters. We're here to talk about the story of Gordie R. Little. Now, you must have had a lot of fun over the years with that R. If people wanted to get out there and guess your middle name, they'd say Robert and Richard and maybe even Rumpelstiltskin. But they wouldn't be right.
Nothing they're familiar with unless they know me. And there's an interesting story attached to that, as there is an interesting story attached to anything. But a good friend of yours and a good friend of mine, a North Country cartoonist, whose home we went to down there in Essex, New York last year, one of the charming personalities of all time, met his wife at a place called Requa Lake down in Rockland County near where I was born. And he and I were sitting and talking about a book that Dr. Nancy Church at Plattsburgh State had written, and he illustrated the book. That's the dog playing with a squeaky toy. These are special sound effects we planned for this whole thing. But in any case, we were sitting talking, and he mentioned that he met his wife at a place that none of us had ever heard of. And he mentioned Requa Lake, which, of course, was my uncle's lake down in Rockland County, and I brought out some identification from my wallet, showed him my middle name was Requa, R-E-Q-U-A, and he was amazed, and we've been fast friends ever since.
That's your mother's maiden name?
That's my mother's maiden name is Requa, and so I'm proud to have that name. It has a wonderful history, obviously. Unlike Castine, which is a fairly common name in some parts of the country.
In very few parts of the country.
Yeah, but I mean, there's certainly more Castines around here than there are Requas, I can tell you that. But anyway, yeah, it's easy to trace your roots when you have a fairly uncommon name, and we have, and from pirates to thieves to priests to you name it, in our history, it's just delicious. They all came over here and settled down near Tarrytown, and a place that's now called Sleepy Hollow, and we all know why, after the Headless Horseman. And many of my relatives are buried right there in that delightful little cemetery next to a Dutch Reformed church in Sleepy Hollow near Tarrytown.
So is it a
French Huguenots who came over here to escape religious persecution, And if all my relatives knew that I became a Catholic when I married Kay, maybe they'd have that revolution all over again. I love it.
The son of a Methodist minister.
That's true. And, you know, I talk a lot about my dad. I wrote a column about him several weeks ago that people found interesting because I talked about looking in the mirror and seeing more of my father every day as I grow older, especially more of his mannerisms. And, yeah, Kay's going with the belly over there. We're going to get her on camera yet. She'll go through and give us a little jibe every now and again. But, yeah, my dad was a super guy, and he was a minister, a Methodist minister for many years. In his youth was a traveling evangelist for the Nazarene Church in the old Billy Sunday days in the first part of this century. He was a great, big, strong, wonderful guy, but just as soft inside as he could be, and he really cared about people. And if there's nothing that I inherited genetically from my dad, that's the thing that I appreciate most, the feeling that you have to help your fellow man because you never know when you're going to need it yourself. And how many times have we proved that ourselves, right?
That's right. And whether you end up collecting on that or not, it's still the right thing to do. And hopefully you'll never end up on the other end of that. How many other, now Little, I think you've said before, is Scottish?
Yeah, that's Scotch-Irish, the name Little, but there are a lot of different extracts along the way. So there's French, Irish, Scotch, English, Dutch, German, and a little Native American in there a few generations back, although some of those old grandparents were there. Especially a great-great-grandmother of mine may not want to admit that. But yes, all of those things are involved, and I'm proud of all of them. I haven't made the trip back to Ireland and Scotland. As a matter of fact, I've never been to Europe at all, but I sure would love to go back and trace those roots firsthand, you know?
So the Little name, though, is
Irish Scotch. Yeah.
Scotch. Okay.
Originally from Scotland, then went to Ireland, and then they moved to England, and then those ancestors, the Littles, moved over here and came to western New York, and my dad's family lived near, as some of our viewers already know, just a little place outside of Rochester called Victor. And we still have to find out if Shirley Kester, the director down at the Clinton County Historical Museum, might be related somewhere. It's possible.
Now, Little would sound to me like a fairly common name. Have you ever hit the search button on your computer and looked up on the internet how many Littles there are?
You know how many Gordon R. Littles there are? You would be amazed. This is true of almost any name. You know, you can get white pages, yellow pages, purple pages, any pages you want off the internet. And I've done some interesting name searches on friends of mine that I thought had strange names. I punched in the name of Albert Richter, a friend of mine who I knew in college back in the 1950s. Haven't seen or heard from the man since I left school down there. And I punched it up, and there were 37 Albert Richters in the initial search. So I have no idea where the guy is or if he's even still alive.
Well, maybe he's like George Foreman and named all of his kids George Foreman.
Yeah. And we didn't have any Georges in our family either. I don't think related to King George, but you never know.
Yeah, I punched in cast iron, and you can get them on, you know, there might be 50, 60 or whatever around the country. Most of them are located here, but they're spread around. But yesterday our friend Gary Chartrand was over, and he's looking for his...
Frank Pabst was looking for his telephone number and or address. We'll have to see.
Gary Chartrand, of course, is the man with the old newspapers.
Newspaper man.
Yeah, and he gave one to Frank Pabst on the sinking of the Titanic, and he had the ones at the raising of the anchor this year on the Battle of Plattsburgh. But one of his ancestors was Johnson, so I just punched in Johnson, and it just overloaded my whole computer.
Really? Oh, Johnson. Hey, Mr. Johnson. Yeah.
It's like looking up Smith or Jones. It says, can you come up with another name besides Johnson to look up?
Yeah, there are a lot of Littles around. You know, I recall when I first moved up here and first came back here to live in 1961, there were no Littles in the area. There were Lytles. Some of our older viewers might remember the famous Lytle family from Channel 5 way back when. But there were no Littles. And now there are lots of Littles, including Little Caesars. So,
Sounds like a whole new column for your...
yeah, and there was Fred Little, who many people in your area might know. He's a wonderful disc jockey, does weddings and things, and works at Wyeth Ayers. And his wife works at Plattsburgh State, but he worked with me at the radio station for a long time. And even though we're not related, he insists on calling me his illegitimate father. So maybe we are. I don't know.
Okay, how many littles were there when you were growing up, Gordie?
Well, you know, my mother and father got married a little later in life. It's not late in life compared to today's standards. My mother was maybe about 30 when she got married. You know, if you weren't married by 20 back in those days, there was something wrong. But she was about 31 when my brother Jim was born. I have an older brother, Jim. Then I was born 4 years later in 1937. My mother was 35 years old and was panic-stricken because the doctor said, "You're awfully old to be having a baby." Isn't that amazing? Some people don't even consider getting married and starting their families until their late 30s now. So times have changed. So there was my brother Jim, talk about colorful characters. He's 4 years older than I, and he's still trying to decide what he wants to be when he grows up. You know, we've all had so many interests in life, and my brother's worked on construction with me during college years for a long time and became a Methodist minister. As a matter of fact, he was down in North Bangor for quite a while and had 7 rural churches. You've heard of the old circuit riders? He was one of them. Raised his large family in North Bangor and moved down south and became a Protestant chaplain at Fort Meade, Maryland for a long time. And since then has gone back into the construction business, working for Habitat for Humanity, building houses with teams. He's run a big mission down south, and he and his wife now live near Washington, Pennsylvania. And so he's the only sibling that I had.
The Habitat for Humanity at the last National Convention for Woodmen of the World, the founder of that was a good friend of the Woodmen President John Bookout was there. And he's quite a dynamic person who was a millionaire and gave it all up just to do his part for humanity by building these homes.
You know, that's one thing, again, that you can thank your parents for. Many of your traits, I suppose, good and bad, are handed down, or at least the propensity for being a certain way. But that's, you know, my parents were always willing to do anything for anybody. And as a Methodist minister, I've talked about my dad many times, living in these rural communities that we lived in. Rather than go into your home and preach to you about how you should live, he would go out in your hayfield and load your hay and help you get your corn in. And, you know, if he saw it was rainy, he'd run to the nearest farmer and say, "Come on, we got to get that hay in on the back 40. And that's why, you know, he was a good person, and my brother has adopted that trait to the point where they always lived in a huge house down in Catonsville, Maryland, and Kay and I would go down and visit with our huge crew of people, you know, whatever vehicle we could stuff all our kids into, and we'd go in, and he'd not only have his kids, but he would take people off the street and befriend them who had no place to stay. You never knew walking into a room who was going to be there. It was like a home for the wayward, you know, and they'd stay for 2 or 3 days, and they'd come back, and
his own little covenant house.
He really did, and then he eventually opened a mission, a rather large mission, and he and his wife worked at it for a long, long time and helped a lot of people, I'm sure, get back on their feet. And, you know, if you can help somebody, that's what life is all about.
Sounds like he's the one I should be talking to.
You know, Jim, he's a colorful guy. He's a very, very good writer. I aspire to be a writer, but he writes in the old Elizabethan style. So his letters, 18, 19 handwritten pages that it takes him 2 months to compose, are tremendously fascinating.
Now let's talk about you as a child. You must have moved around a little bit.
Bad kid. Not a very nice kid.
Let's talk about moving around.
I was born in Rockland County in a place called Pearl River. My dad was a young minister in those days, and we moved around to places like Muncie and Spring Valley, But my first recollections are really of a place called Thornwood in Westchester County, only a couple of miles from Pleasantville. Familiar to people for two reasons. First of all, there was a recent movie which has nothing to do with that Pleasantville, but Pleasantville has been the home of the Reader's Digest, where the Reader's Digest has been published since the early 1920s. I mention that for a couple of reasons. My dad worked part-time there to make ends meet as a minister. His $13 or $15 a week salary didn't quite cut it back in those days, and so he worked nights at the Reader's Digest and knew the founders of the Reader's Digest and were very friendly with them. So that's where we lived until I was just getting into third grade. And as you know, ministers, clergymen often move frequently, and so he left Thornwood and was sent to Carthage, also in northern New York, not far from Watertown. And we lived there only a little over 1 year, spent most of third grade there, started learning how to play the trombone, and lived right near the school in a couple of different places there. But my dad had problems with the hierarchy in the Nazarene church there. He was still a Nazarene minister in those days. And so he left the church, had a friend who was a Methodist minister in Carthage and Watertown in those days, became a Methodist minister. And we had to go back to school and do all the things that the Methodist church required. And then we moved to a place called Messina Center.
Okay, we'll pick up again in Messina Center, but this must have been kind of tough for your father to make ends meet when he's going back to school to...
It was extremely difficult, very, very difficult, but families, at least our families, were very used to being poor. And as you've talked to people who are now adults, said we didn't know we were poor because we didn't know anybody who was rich. You know, you read in the newspapers and heard about people who had a lot of money, but you didn't have any direct association with them. And you know, people were very resourceful, like farm people that you know here in Clinton County, always made do. Recycled everything. We invented recycling before it was long before it was popular, right?
That's right.
And we talked with Shirley Kester right down to their making rugs out of the rags in the rag bag. So we didn't know we were poor. It was difficult to make ends meet. It was very, very difficult. My mother worked in a sweatshop laundry down there in Westchester County for some time, and I can't remember what she made, but I know it was less than 43 cents an hour. I don't know why that figures in my mind. Eventually the laundry burned down, and she was out of work, but she worked part-time in the laundry, and my dad worked part-time at the Reader's Digest, and very often in our little tiny church there in Westchester County, there would be nobody there but our family on a Sunday morning. We'd light the stove, and my father would preach a sermon with fire and brimstone just as if there was Billy Graham's 5,000 people out there, because he figured we needed it as much as anybody did. But those were good days, very strict days.
When he passed the basket, there must have been mighty slim pickings.
There were, but even in our Catholic Church, we use the word tithe all the time. You and I were talking about it the other day privately. But back in those days, that's the only way the church could survive. So you always put a certain percentage of your income in the plate, no matter how many people were there. And there were times when the church was full, when my dad would bring singers in from Harlem, because my dad was a missionary in every sense of the word. You know, being a missionary includes a lot of different aspects, including helping that farmer with his hay. But he also had missions in the Bowery in New York City, and in Chinatown, and in Harlem. And he would go into town, and he developed social programs long before anybody in neighborhoods did. We had an old Packard, and he would pack 13 young Chinese kids from Chinatown in that Packard, bring them to our house to spend the day to see what a typical family in the Westchester County lived like. Although we were never very typical, we had an awful lot of fun. So he would take me to those missions, and I got a view of all kinds of humanity through my dad's eyes in those missions, and talk about helping people who were truly down and out, because you have to remember those were the days right after the Depression, when there were an awful lot of people hanging around New York City who had those bucks that I just mentioned who didn't have them anymore. So, yeah, that was a very interesting part of my childhood, and we stayed there until third grade and then moved to Carthage.
So you're talking third grade, so you're talking 8 years old maybe, so that's 1945. You're talking the period through World War II.
Oh boy, what a time period to grow up. Of course, you young people wouldn't remember that, but my dad was not only the local clergyman in that little community of Thornwood, but he was an air raid warden. And you know, there was a different aura surrounding World War II than there has been almost any other conflict. Of course, I wasn't around for the Great War, the First World War. I know what the feeling was generally like, but the Second World War was one of those righteous wars. And so it held a tremendous charm for a little boy. You know, you couldn't wait to put on your sailor suit or your army hat and get a wooden gun and march down the street. So this whole bit about the air raid warnings and where the lights would go out and the sirens would sound and the shades would come down and my dad would put on the black band and head out, and the next day my mother would get gunny sacks, as we called them, and we'd go out and collect milkweed. I don't know, what did they use milkweed for? Was that for flotation devices?
I have no idea.
Neither do I, but I can remember going down the ditches and stuffing milkweed into the bags and recycling newspapers and helping with the war effort in every way. And still somewhere in a drawer back in this house, I've got one of the little ration books with the little stamps you'd have in it. And it was hard to buy sugar and gasoline, and everyone in the family had one of those.
So you didn't use all your coupons?
We must not. Maybe the war was over, or maybe. I have a feeling that my dad exercised his privilege as a clergyman to maybe get a little extra bag of sugar here and there, because my dad liked sugar about as much as I do, and he had to keep his strength up, you know, so.
Well, being an air raid warden and a clergyman, he must have
he probably had and there's so many stories attached to that time period, you know. I could focus on that for the rest of this program. It was a very interesting time to grow up. You know, you drew pictures of airplanes. I can remember sitting while my dad was preaching those powerful sermons, trying to probably get to my young mind. I was off imagining I was in the war as a pilot, and I'm drawing pictures, and somewhere there are some old hymn books, maybe hundreds of them, with pictures of Messerschmitts and P-38s and Black Widow spiders and all those old airplanes from the World War. Great times.
Okay, so then you went to Messina Center.
Little tiny community down past the aluminum plant, heading out of Messina past what is now the St. Lawrence Seaway, the Eisenhower Locks. Continue down that little road till you come to a bend in the Grass River. That is one of the most beautiful spots on earth. You know how much I love it here in Morrisonville, Schuyler Falls, Clinton County, Peasleyville, and all the other areas around the North Country. I love it. But to go home for me is to go to Messina Center. You know, we all like to go back and search for our roots. No other place is as pleasant for me as Messina Center. A little tiny community, essentially unchanged for the last 75 years. Many of the same names on the same mailboxes. Perhaps as few as 25 families lived there. One-room schoolhouse. Actually, 2 rooms in this schoolhouse. Right next to the tiny little wooden church where my dad was the minister, and the school and the church were the focus of just about all the community's activities back in those days. And so I spent from the second half of my 3rd grade through 8th grade in that little tiny school. And those teachers, I've often said, had as much influence on me as my own parents did. They were amazing to put up with these boisterous and sometimes outlandish antics of these young kids and actually get some sense in their heads and instill in them a love for knowledge and learning is truly amazing. And I left the 8th grade there and started high school at Messina, and what seemed to me the biggest school I had ever seen in my life. You look at it today, and it was smaller than the old Plattsburgh High School, which is long since gone, downtown Plattsburgh, where the Stafford Middle School is located now. But that was a big deal to travel all the way to Messina to go to high school, and I almost finished my freshman year in high school there when my dad moved again, and this time it was to Moira.
So you didn't
Not
move-
to be
not too
confused
far.
with Mariah.
No, you didn't move too far then.
No, we didn't move that far. And it was another small community, Moira. Just to put it in perspective for our viewers, around the North Country is located the other side of Malone, about 11 miles on Route 11, and it's the home of the famous Crossroads restaurant. It's a Greyhound bus stop. But none of that was there when I was a youngster.
Well, it's like you can't say Minneapolis without saying St. Paul. You can't say Mariah without saying Brushton.
Yeah, Moira Brushton is now the centralized school. Of course, I'm so old.
I hate to tell you, Gordie, it's Brushton, Moira.
Brushton Moira, is that what it is?
Not Moira, Brushton.
Oh, I'm sorry about
Moira got second billing.
Actually, the school is closer to Brushton than it is to Moira. But that wasn't even built when I went there. The old high school that I attended was torn down. Maybe we demolished it so much that they couldn't use it anymore, but it had been built before the Civil
War.
War.
Your initials in the desk there?
No, man, that goes back to Messina Center in that little desk. That's an interesting story all by itself. How that school desk, the school has been torn down, that little tiny school in Messina Center for years, and a friend of ours who moved into a schoolhouse out in Salmon River, on the Salmon River Road, wanted to find a school desk, and the wife said to the husband, "Go get me an old school desk. What good is a schoolhouse without a school desk?" And he traveled. He doesn't even know where he went. I'm sure he was so mad by the time he found this old school desk and brought it back and plunked it down. And she'd had it in the front of that schoolhouse inside and had flowers on it for maybe a year before she noticed a little tiny name had been
little tiny here. About this.
little tiny name had been scratched in by somebody, some kid, some rotten kid with a, you know what a compass was, with a pointy thing
Oh,
on
yeah.
one side and a pencil on the other. And she called me up all excited, "Gordie, how many Gordon Littles are there?" I said, "Not many." She said, "I got your name on this school desk." Where he got it and how it ended up just a couple of miles from my house as the crow flies, we'll never know, but it's one of the great stories.
Well, I will go to my grave believing that it was some girl who was in love with Gordie Little.
Who carved it?
Yeah.
Probably not. Well, we never got in trouble for that. We did use the inkwells, however, to dip
Pigtails?
pigtails. And there is a woman who lives less than a mile from here who went to that school with me who still says I ruined her hair forever by constantly with the pigtails. And I'm very nice to her even today because she knows a lot of things about me that probably would be best not published.
Well, blue hair is attractive.
And she always beat me at marbles, too. And my mother kept saying, "You let a girl win 8 mason jars full of marbles from you?" At least I brought the jars back home to her. I said, "What do you want?"
I was the marble loser in the family. My brother Sam was the winner. So,
was good?
So he'd win, and we'd split him, and I'd go back and lose half, and he'd win the other half the next day.
I was terrible, and I was very gullible. And I just liked the idea of playing marbles. And it took me a while to learn that you're supposed to bring home more than you left with. But it never seemed to work out that way.
Now, you said teachers back there in Messina Center. Was this a one-room school?
It was actually a 2-room school. It was a stucco building, relatively small rooms with a wood furnace, I'm sure. And I'm not sure if it had indoor plumbing, but it maybe did or maybe didn't back in those days. Probably didn't, and the water came from I know it didn't because there was a pump out front. And in our room, I'll never forget, there was this beautiful crockery water cooler, and with a little silver spout on the side, chromium spout. And if you were a good person that day, you were allowed to go out and get the water in the pail. While the other classes were being held, you would go outside, and of course it would take me a very long time. Because once I was outside, it was like that dog on the floor down here, man, I was away from there. But I'd eventually make it back and get the water. You'd have to prime it and get the water and fill the pail, and then I'd I learned how gravity works and centrifugal
Oh,
force,
yeah.
and I'd swing it around, and we'd stop for a little game of one-o cat with some of the older kids that weren't in school. And so the water that I'd pour in generally had a lot of broken blades of grass, pieces of dirt and sand. So I was always in trouble. The other great thing in grade school was to be able to go back out because there was a fire escape. We were on the second floor once we got into fifth grade, 4 grades on each floor. And then you get out to clap the erasers in the back. And I don't know, I'd always miss one hand with the other, and the eraser would go flying, and I'd find a way to go down the fire escape. So I'm sure those old teachers went to their graves wishing they never, ever had another student like Gordie Little. But it was a great experience. They were wonderful. Those teachers were wonderful. Agnes Labarge was the one who taught me from 5th grade through 8th grade, and I never forgot her, although I didn't realize that she had moved to Ellenburg Depot, until I read her death in the news on the radio many years later. I think she made it to 97 or 98. And then I regretted not having gone back to thank her over and over again for the influence she had in my life.
We're going to pick up on this story, and we're going to pick up in Moira when we come back. All right.
She does that almost as good as you are with the...
Roll 'em.
Yeah, roll them. Roll camera. Where were we? I forgot.
We just moved to Moira.
Oh, yes, Moira and the old Moira High School. I lived right around the corner from the high school, and I was always the last one to get to school every day. And right around the corner from a beautiful, big brick church. My dad was the minister there. It was just had a tremendous history. The organ had been brought by ox cart from Potsdam back in the early 1800s, and it had what they called the coffin corners and the winding stairs that went up to the sanctuary, and they called them coffin corners so that they could get the coffins up there during the funerals. But that was a very charming community once again, and that's where I went for 4 years of school, and I was inspired not only by teachers but by musicians, people who had either retired from other schools or were just starting out in the music or teaching business, were hired by these small school districts, but they were passionate. And even though I know many teachers who are passionate today, I also know some others who are not necessarily passionate. And when I see teachers who aren't able to instill that wonderful fever for learning that teachers did for me, then it makes me sad in this day and age. But back in those days, that's where I really developed my strong sense of loving all kinds of music. I had a music teacher there who's long since deceased, who was a fine clarinetist and trombone player, and he gave me private lessons all 4 years, you know, in the band room all by myself for 2 or 3 hours at a time, because he knew I was interested. And those are the people you thank when you look back on it. That was a tremendous way to get an education in an old school that was not dissimilar from the old high school right here in Morrisonville that has been long since replaced by the St. Alexander's Roman Catholic Church.
So that took you to, 1955 you graduated?
Yes, and those were the days with the engineer's boots and the pig pants and the long sideburns. And my mother, of course, you know, we went to church. It was a regular thing to do. And my mother would say, "You're not walking in church with those sideboards on. You're not my son. I'm going in, then you come in and sit in another place. I don't want anybody to know that you're related to me." And I had to come in later because it was my job to ring the bell. And of course, I would see if I could flip the bell over, and I wasn't a great kid.
So you were a James Dean fan?
Oh, you know, all of that stuff. But those were, as you know, the 50s was another very interesting decade in American history, and a big part of Gordie Little's history, because I did graduate from Moira High School, 1955. I'm proud to say I was valedictorian in my class, but don't get too excited. There were only 11 of us. And I was up there to give my valedictory speech. I spent a lot of time writing it, maybe 7 or 8 minutes just before we went. Once again, my mother's going crazy, and I worked very hard to memorize that for the last 30 seconds or so before the event started, and I stood up there, and I said, "Good evening," and that's all I could remember. And my English teacher's in the side saying, "Ladies and gentlemen." And that's the way it went. She would say one sentence, and I would say the next sentence. My mother had long since left in embarrassment.
So you weren't able to bring up your sheet to read off? You couldn't read it?
No, I couldn't read it. You had to memorize it, and thank God that she had it over there on the side trying to read my left-handed southpaw writing, and we got through the speech, and people talked about that speech for a long time to come. And I might add, another connection with the Reader's Digest, schools were very poor back then, as some of our parochial schools still are, and even some of our public schools. And so my grand prize for being valedictorian of the class was 1-year subscription to the Reader's Digest. And I've subscribed to it ever since. As a matter of fact, I have a collection of the Reader's Digest in boxes out in my garage that dates all the way back to the beginning in the 1920s.
Oh, wow.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick the one the day you were born and see what happened that year. It's interesting.
Yeah, and Reader's Digest, of course, hasn't changed that much over the years. It's kind of kept its basic roots.
Basic roots, and certainly the concept of being a digest and a concentration of a lot of the good writing of the day, but always a positive note. You notice that? With their anti-smoking campaigns and their health campaigns, and always a positive, enriching experience. It's almost like a religious document when you get it. And they've expanded on that down through the years, but maintained that always that positive theme, trying to expose the bad things in government and trying to bring you things like humor and uniform and all of those great categories that people love to read. And it's in many languages. I can remember my mother, just before her death, trying to read the big print version of the Reader's Digest with her little magnifying glass because she didn't want to miss it. And I'm sure next to the Holy Bible, that the first things that were written to me next to the classics, and my mother and father were both great readers out loud when we were kids, was the Reader's Digest. When the new copy would come in, since my dad worked there, we would sit down on the couch and my mother would read it to us cover to cover. No television in those days.
Now, I'm going to pick my wife's memory here. It was one of those machines that, in one of the buildings we visited, was set up for Reader's Digest. The last show we did was at the former Harris Graphics, in that large building we went in toward the end.
Exactly.
They set up a whole row of machines there to print out the Reader's Digest. So the machines that those were printed on, or not were printed on, but were bound on, were made right there in Champlain.
Oh, man, and after we finish this program, I know you have to run, but after we finish the program, I'll show you some bound early editions of the Reader's Digest. People love to take National Geographic and Reader's Digest and other popular magazines or digests of the day and bind them in book form. Mm-hmm. So you'd have 5 or 6 inside hard covers, and I still have some of those dating back many, many years. Cool, and they were bound right up there.
Well, the machinery that bound them was made there. Yeah,
I love it.
Stitched and all those things are
that
made
was
in Champlain.
You talk about favorite things. Of course, the last thing I did is always the favorite thing I've ever done in my life. I'm just enthusiastic about life and about people in general, but that was a tremendous program that we did up there with Bob.
Yeah, that again, when I start thinking about our favorite show, we've done so many that I think are important, and if they aren't historic now, they will be.
Personally important. We talked about Sid Cauchy and having met his wife at Lake Requa, but what an interesting personality. That was just a terrific day. The man is so humble and yet so talented. He has more talent in his little pinky thumb nail than I have in my whole body, and yet he's very humble about it.
And Jim Shaughnessy, when we went to Stowe, the man who put together those great Rutland book and the D&H book.
That?
You know, that was, to me, that was an honor to sit down and chat with that man.
And there are others. I mean, we have plans. We have grandiose plans about the other people we'd like to talk to, and sometimes we even go back and cover the same subject matter again, because there's always more to learn about people and places than you can get in a cursory view the first time.
One we're hoping for, and we're gonna make it happen, is a man named Ozzie Sweet,
Oh boy.
who grew up in New Russia, which is just outside of Elizabethtown, and became the big man. If you were a sports fan in the 1950s and 60s, you've seen this man's work. He took the photos for a majority of the covers of Sport magazine and all those great photos. And we've talked to him, and he's willing to do a story with us, but we got to go to New Hampshire to do it. But it's one of those things we're going to do. And he's a man who has been in the movies. He's appeared in movies with Hopalong Cassidy, and I'm just looking forward to that.
As we have to many of the other things we've done, and believe it or not, there are a few places we haven't visited here in Clinton County. I love the historic homes and buildings, and so do you. And I have such a terrible memory. I'll get so passionate about reading Marjorie Lansing Porter or somebody else's history of a given area, and I'll remember everything for about 2 or 3 minutes, because I was always a quick study, and I would retain the information I can remember in college just long enough to pass the test, and then it was gone. And my memory hasn't improved, as you know, for names ever since that time. But yeah, there are a lot of things to do, and we've had a lot of fun at it.
And that's one of the things that I enjoy when I rerun right now the shows I did with Bob Ben, is you start playing those, you say, oh, I forgot that, I forgot this, I forgot that. There's so much history there that we can't retain it all. And then to play it again and to hear it again, it comes back, and maybe if you hear it 3 or 4 times, it settles in.
That's why those archives, at some point, have to be made available to the world. I don't know how to do it, but we have people in colleges and universities that travel down to the hills of Kentucky to record the old music that people sang and played. Well, you've got literally hundreds of people, thousands of people in their 70s, 80s, 90s, some 100 years old is what I'm talking about, who got that oral history of the place they lived or grew up in. And when they're gone, it's gone, except for that videotape. So that's why we enjoy doing what we do.
Oh, definitely. Okay, we've gotten you
through high school.
Through high school now.
By hook and
Are you in the rodeo yet?
Oh, well, obviously my family had no money to pay for college, and even though college was very inexpensive back in those days, it was difficult to make ends meet. I applied to 5 colleges, and I had a good enough average in high school, so that I was accepted at all of them. And my parents wanted me to go to a religious school. My father and mother both graduated from religious colleges, Kingswood and Asbury in the state of Kentucky, since you mentioned Kentucky. And they wanted me to go to a religious school, and I wanted to be a civil engineer. I was a math whiz in high school. I was lucky enough to have a principal at Moira High School who even developed a curriculum to satisfy my need because he knew I was interested in math, and there were very few kids in school in the first place, so he would come up with an advanced algebra course, and I would be the one that would sit there, and he'd bang it into my head. All this after he convinced me that elementary algebra was something I could eventually master, because I could not do it. But once I got it in 9th grade, then I went on from there, and I wanted to be a civil engineer. So I wanted to go to I was thinking of going to Canton Tech, as they called it, ATC, or to Letourneau Institute out in Longview, Texas, or somewhere where I could become a civil engineer and work in the field and go to college at the same time. But being the minister in town, my parents eventually wanted me to go to Houghton College in western New York, and it's another school that would probably just as soon forget that Gordie Little ever stepped on its campus. Although, after they kicked me out, I must say, they sent me more alumni material than any other college I ever went to. And they asked me to be, maybe we shouldn't be saying this, but they asked me to be the speaker at one of their local banquets for alumni a few years back, and I told them all the reasons why they probably didn't want to have me there. My experiences at Houghton were a great learning experience for me, but not necessarily having my stuff all together back in those years. I broke a lot of their rules, which were extremely strict, beyond what you could ever believe, and that's changed a lot now. And I don't mean to denigrate the college or its alumni in any way, it's a wonderful school in so many ways now. But for me, it was the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so I lasted almost a year.
They still consider you an alumni.
Yeah, they do. So I didn't necessarily graduate when I should have. I should have graduated from college in 1959 because of that experience. I finished there, and then I matriculated, or tried to, at Syracuse University, and got down there and didn't like the looks of things and didn't like the married housing that they offered me, and so I just got in my car and drove away.
Were you married at the time?
Yeah, 1957, the first time around, and I ended up going to Clarkson for a year. I still wanted to be a civil engineer. I went to Clarkson for a year, and I did make the whole year. And it wasn't until the very end of the year that they wrote me that letter saying, we'd prefer that you never step foot on this campus again.
Not only at Clarkson, they didn't want him in Potsdam either.
No, in bed. No, in the whole area. So I keep my eye over my shoulder when I drive through St. Lawrence County these days. But that was a good experience, and, you know, I don't regret any of those times. You always regret the pain you cause your poor parents. My father would drive up there and sit in the car outside, and tears would run down his face, and he'd say, why? Where did I go wrong?
Well,
And I always assumed the full responsibility for my actions, as I still do, and it was a great learning experience, and I don't regret it. And I look back to all those old professors, if they're still alive, and say, the reason I failed in Clarkson was because the physics book was too darn thick. I mean, that baby, I could not fathom the first page, and it was all downhill after that. That was a good experience, and so I left there, and then I heard about a new, my parents still lived in Moira, but I was going around to all these colleges by then, and I heard about a new experimental math and science school that they were trying to put together on Long Island. And it was going to be called the State University of New York Long Island Center. And it was to be established on a beautiful estate called Planting Fields, the Coe Estate, located between Oyster Bay and Glen Cove. And so I drove down there and drove onto this estate, and it was like driving onto the grounds of a manor house in England or a castle in Austria. It was fabulous. There were 500 and some acres of all beautifully manicured trees and shrubs, everyone maintained by the students at Farmingdale on Long Island. It was fabulous. And I said, this is where I go to school for free. There was no state tuition back in those days. So I went and talked to the dean of students, and he said, I see you got kicked out of a couple of schools. And I smiled, and I said, yeah, I thought that was it for me. He says, you're my kind of guy. You're exactly the kind of student we're looking for. I said, ooh, you and I could get along very, very well. He liked what he saw and liked what he heard me say, because I never tried to hide anything. I was not a very good liar, so I didn't try to hide any of the things that I had done in other schools. But he said, I think you're the kind of person we're looking for. And I agreed, and I went there for 4 years, and it was a wonderful educational experience. The school, of course, is now Stony Brook. I was in the very first graduating class. I was on hand when Governor Nelson Rockefeller got on a big D8 Caterpillar and tried to break ground for the new campus at Stony Brook and almost tipped it over. And I got it all on audio tape. They didn't have videotape in those days, of course, and the first thing he did was put the blade down and then full force. The blade is digging in, and the back end of the cat is coming up, and somebody was quick enough to jump on and say, Governor, don't give up your day job.
I hope he had his hard hat on.
Oh, he had a hard hat on, but it was kind of askew by the time he finished. So that was a delicious experience, and that campus is now a huge campus at Stony Brook. But what a pleasure to go to school that way and have very tiny classes. They hired the top scientific minds in the country to teach there because this was an experimental math and science school. They developed some very bizarre degrees for those people who didn't want to continue on in being math and science teachers. So I got a Bachelor of Science degree in humanities. And graduated from there in 1961, and it was very interesting because we had a beautiful small choir that I sang in that sang at graduation, so I'd run up and sing a song, and then run back down and sit there and listen to a speech, and run up and sing another song, and it was outside, beautiful, beautiful weather, and a nice experience. And unfortunately, I've only stayed in contact with a few of the people that taught there and a few of the students, but of the 145, I think, that matriculated, only 20, between 23 and 27 made it through 4 years and graduated. Good experience, though.
Now, he's going to have to tell me what matriculated means here. 145 of you matriculated. It doesn't sound good.
Well, that's when you get there and you set up and start your classes and get your schedules and begin the process of going to college as part of the matriculation process in the beginning. And the classes were held in a manor house that had been brought over stone by stone from the old country. And think of going to college now, sending your kids to a college where they have bathrooms where the fixtures are all solid marble and gold-plated fixtures on the solid marble, where you walk into the great room, as they called it, with a fireplace bigger than our entire wall here in this room, and you have paintings that were done in 1200, 13, 1400 of knights and so on that are like 16 feet high, and none of the students damaged anything.
You walk into something like that, you must feel like you have to behave.
Oh, it was a wonderful experience, and they had in that great hall they had a grand piano, a 12-foot, I believe it was, grand piano, and the sound that piano made was incredible. And there were tremendous acoustics in that room, and I loved to sing in those days and sang a lot. And boy, when you sang there and the sound came back to you, it was almost a religious experience. But the entire campus was very beautiful, and it was used as a campus. Now it's still open to the public as planting fields, and anybody who visits Long Island can drive through and see where I graduated from college, as if that would
They
be...
must have a sign there that says, Gordie Little graduated here?
Probably not, but some of the paintings we did on the roadways nearby there with spray paint may still be around unless they paved them over.
He's not encouraging you kids to go out and do that.
No, not at all. Not even close. It was a great experience. It was a wonderful experience. It was a way of teaching that kids don't get in college anymore. There were no lectures. There were roundtable discussions. There would be 6 or 8 people in a room with a professor. The professor would throw your bone for discussion in the beginning, and that's how your class would go. You were encouraged to respond all the time, rather than to listen to somebody pontificate. You were encouraged to respond, to give your opinions, right, wrong, or indifferent, because that's how you were encouraged to learn. And I've never forgotten that learning experience. I never forget a biology final. One time, an 8-hour biology final in my senior year, one question: what is man? I can't remember what I got for a mark. I remember sitting there stunned and sweating a lot before I began to write. Can you imagine? But what a great experience. Wonderful college experience. And so I left there in 1961.
With a degree. We'll be back. One of the other things that we have in the pipeline that has nothing to do with our little corner is I want to get together with my friend Ken Delafrange, who owns Frontier Town, and do a little series on a guy named Tom Tyler, who was born Vincent Markowski in Port Henry, and became a very famous at the time cowboy star in the late era of the silent movies and in the early talkies. And I've gotten a dozen of his movies, and we're going to put something together with Ken in the future. And I'm talking with Gordie about this. I found out that Gordie Little was a cowboy star himself many years ago.
Not very much of a star, but I would like to have been a bigger star than I was. That's where I always loved to act in shows and loved to sing. As you know, you can see the ham through and through. But I got an opportunity to work in a western village that was called Adventure Town. And it was located in those days in Alexandria Bay up in the Thousand Islands. I told you my dad lived in Clayton for a while. My dad moved to Clayton while I was in college. And he was a Methodist minister in Clayton, and I always enjoyed the Thousand Islands area.
He was just trying to get away from Potsdam.
Trying to get farther away from me, but I always managed to find him. But Alexandria Bay is a beautiful little tourist community, which makes its livelihood off of people who come to see the Thousand Islands. And this adventure town was a beautiful western village, and I applied for work there one summer and was allowed to go in. And I did all the things there was to do. Dress up in the every kid's dream, right? To dress up in the cowboy suit, put the sharp pointed shoes on, get shot 50 times a day. The whole place opened up with a team of horses pulling a stagecoach at lickety-split speed into town with us firing out the shotguns at the robbers who were trying to stop the stagecoach, and all the little kids are waiting behind the gate for the place to open. And what a spectacular way, with the dust flying and shooting. And I think I've told you this story. The first day I went in there, they gave me a double-barreled shotgun and said, you have to fire a whole box of shells from the time you start up there on the hill till the time you get to town. It was very fast because those horses could move. Fire the whole shell, and the guy said, you put 4 shells in your mouth, double-barreled, fire both barrels, let her go, click it open, throw those click out, put 2 more in, use the whole box of shells. Didn't tell me where to aim the gun. I thought they were blanks, of course. Couldn't hurt anybody, right? Wrong. The robbers would ride very close to the stagecoach trying to hold us up, and I'm shooting right at them. And I'm burning the guys. The fire would shoot out of a shotgun about 6 feet, so I almost lost my job the first morning the place opened. And these guys came up to me, these old cowboys that had been, and said, hey, kid, you point the gun up in the air and fire. Make believe you're shooting at us. See what you did to my chaps? There'd be a hole in the guy's chaps. So I learned very quickly. Met a lot of great people. They had a steam train there. We traveled around and the train would get robbed. We had this big dramatic episode called High Noon, a recreation of, the High Noon story. And I would have to fall off a low roof, maybe about 9 or 10 feet high. I'd have to fall and roll because I'd be shot. And every time I'd hit the ground, I weighed about 198 pounds back in those days, the boots would split out. I think they were called Acme boots, and there was a little shop in the Western Village that sold them, and they probably, another organization that wished they never saw Gordie Little again, because every third day it'd come in and say, my boots are split out. They were guaranteed. Got a new pair each time. And I'd get shot and land on the ground and play dead for the rest of the scene, and the little kids would come along with their pointed cowboy boots and kick the dead guy in the head to make sure he was really dead. So I almost developed a severe distaste for young children during that whole time period, but I came to love them after I learned how to keep my head away, and so they kicked me in the rear instead of in the head. It was a great experience. I met a lot of people who were experienced rodeo riders. They had a rodeo there, and I learned to ride Brahma bulls. Maybe the dumbest single thing I've done in a long string of not very smart things in my life, but riding those Brahma bulls is an experience closer to death than anything short of real expiration, and you were never sure that you were going to live through it. They're amazingly strong, powerful, and quick for their immense size. So I loved to ride the bulls all summer in the rodeo.
You actually enjoyed it?
I actually enjoyed it. Never got killed. Didn't have any idea what I was doing. They teach you how to wrap your hands and how to do it, and I'd go out and do it, and got fairly good at it by the end of the summer when it was time to leave, and made some very fast friends that I stayed in touch with for quite a long time.
What year was this?
Who knows? Maybe 1956, maybe, or 57, in that era. I worked on construction, worked on some wonderful construction projects. Talk about history. That's where I became familiar with Plattsburgh, driving back and forth from Moira, 65 miles each way, to work on Plattsburgh Air Force Base. Most of our viewers, and certainly listeners and newspaper readers, know that I worked on construction here, helping to build a base, and developed a love for this area, and that's one of the reasons I came back here in '61. Worked on the base, Worked on that St. Lawrence Seaway right from the beginning to almost the very end on Long Sault Dam, Eisenhower Lock. Worked on a chainsaw gang clearing land for Route 81 in the Watertown area, Black River. Worked in a moccasin factory. You know, you do what you need to do to make money to go to college, and all those are life experiences that I wouldn't take back, not 1 minute of them.
Okay, now you said you were married during your college years. You got two sons with your
Two
first
sons,
wife?
Gordie and Kirk, was divorced and was lucky enough to find Kay, who has so far avoided the camera today, but all
She's
of
looking
our,
for pictures.
yeah, she's been looking for those pictures. But what a wonderful person to meet, and what a great family. She had 11 of her own children at that time, and I had my 2 from the divorce. And it's hard to believe, but we've been married 25 years. May 4th, 1974, we were married, and quit smoking February 8th, 1975, both of us on the same day. But it's been a great experience to have this big family take me in and pull me up by my bootstraps and reinforce each other, and the experience of having this wonderful family has been just terrific.
That's about time my wife Judy quit smoking in 1975.
She was only 6?
Yeah, well, she
She's
started.
laughing. You can see the camera shake. She thinks that's very funny.
She started going out with me, and she knew I had asthma, and she, on her own, I didn't ask her to. She gave up smoking.
You talk about, I'll never forget this. There are a lot of great memories just with Calvin and doing this program called Our Little Corner when that fire safety trailer came in and you and I went in and they had this manufactured smoke. Doesn't bother anybody, won't hurt anybody, and I'm crawling through the smoke and Calvin's in the back trying to get a breath. It's a miracle you didn't shut the camera off and leave.
Then he says, it doesn't bother anybody unless they got asthma.
Unless they have asthma. Yeah, he threw that word in there.
At the end, yeah, after it was
Yeah.
all over. Yeah. So, you've got 11 stepchildren besides your own 2 children?
As most of our viewers know, and I don't want to dwell on it, our oldest son and his wife were killed in a car accident in 1988, early in November. And he was the oldest of the 11 Baker kids. And we were given the privilege of raising their 2 children who were 8 and 11, Chad and Megan at the time. And now they're grown up, and Megan is 18, attending UMass. And Chad's an entrepreneur, bought into a coffee shop in downtown Plattsburgh and enjoying life, and he's going on 22. So life goes on, doesn't it?
Yeah. That was certainly a sad part of the Gordie Little story, Gordie and Kay Little story. 1988, you say?
1988, but you do remember what I said before about it coming back to you? When you befriend people and do nice things for other people who, in times of trouble, it comes back to you manyfold, and that proved it over and over again, because not only did we lose our Gary and Kim, but a beautiful little 8-year-old grandson 2 days later on his way to the funeral home from a hockey game in Chazy. So, yeah, it was tough, but the experience becomes ultimately it gives you extra strength to help other people. Your worst fear is anybody viewing this now, and again, I didn't want to dwell on it, but anybody viewing this program knows your worst fear is have somebody knocking on your door at night saying your children are dead. And you work from there, and where the strength comes from, you don't know. Our neighborhood priest was over here sitting on our couch, friends gathered around, nobody knew what to say. That's why I learned to hug people. I was brought up in a family where the affection wasn't demonstrative. You know, you would shake your father's hand on your birthday, but your father didn't give you a hug. My father learned how to hug in later years, and I was embarrassed to hug my own father when I was 35 years old, until later all these terrible things happened and it dawned on me. Those hugs are very, very important, and when your best friend comes up, or even a casual acquaintance, and hugs you and says, "I'm sorry," when you're in trouble, those are the things you never forget. So yeah, that's where this North Country, you're talking about ice storms and other personal disasters that people face. That's when you learn who your who your real friends are, and those are the people that I try to give back to every day of my life.
Now, in addition to picking up 11 extra children when you married Kay, you also became a Catholic. Again, we won't dwell on this because religion is very personal to
Well,
everyone.
we can dwell on it.
Oh.
I would love to. It just happens that Kay's sister and brother-in-law lived right across the street, and Donald was a deacon of the church, and
Donald who?
Donald Dashnaw, and with their huge family, talk about big families, a deacon in the church, and I did my catechism and I did my studying, and we did the bit and renewed our vows. Kay and I have been married, as I didn't tell you, in the chapel, that beautiful, charming chapel on the old base. That's why I didn't want anything to happen to that, to tear that down or change the historic aspect of the old base oval, and that, because that was, of course, the great moment of my life when Kay and I were married by a chaplain in the Air Force in that facility. And then we were married and did our vows in the Catholic Church, and I became a Catholic and baptized in the Catholic Church. Come to find out, my own father hadn't baptized me as a Methodist minister in all those years. He baptized everybody else like John the Baptist and forgot his own kids.
Oh, you kidding me?
So we went, Judy saying, oh. But isn't that interesting? So we went through the whole process and got Rome to bless the thing and became Catholic. And besides a good game of Scrabble, and I have to tell our viewers that Kay beat me by about 200 points last night. Besides a good game of Scrabble, the high point of our life was being able to go to Mass every Sunday morning at 7:30 Mass at St. Alexander's Church. It's where your whole life comes together in that 1 hour. And you get to apologize to the Almighty for your transgressions, of which I have many, but you also get to give thanks, and we're grateful for good health and great family and many friends.
Yeah, I feel that if you can't give back an hour in a week's time, something's wrong.
I always find ways. I did in the radio business, as much as being personally satisfying to go on the air and tell these silly stories about your life and other things, being able to help people and raise money. As you know, all the old street drives and so on was a great experience to be able to do things and actually advocate for people during that 36-year career, and then fall by pure serendipity into a job that allows you to advocate and even have that in the title of your job description every day of your life. So as a victim's advocate in the probation department, I get to help people every single day. It's great.
We're going to move up to 1998 in just a moment, but first we need to find out how you ended up in radio. You obviously didn't go to college to become a radio star.
But some things are meant to be. If you could only view that handwriting in the wall before you run into it nose first, and that's the way my life has been. Just run into something and say, oh, okay, we're here, let's do something about it. I wanted to be that civil engineer. Then I wanted to be a teacher. Then I wanted to be a lot of things. I probably wanted to be a rodeo star at one point in time, and acting, people came up and said, boy, you're doing well at that, do you ever think of acting? And, all of those things were going through my mind. But then I must say, in my very first year at Houghton College, one of the most positive experiences from what could have been a disaster for other people was a little radio show that I did at their college radio station, and they had a very good one. And Clarkson had an excellent radio station back in those days. And so I worked the second semester, spent more time there than I did going to class, I confess. That was in the back of my mind, even as a small child, when wire recorders were invented and then tape recorders were invented. I would fantasize that I was a big-time announcer, and I would make up news stories, I still have some of those old recordings. And then on Long Island, even though there was no radio station at the university campus, I always had an old Wallensack tape recorder. And my friends and I would sit there and sing songs and record radio shows and make believe. Develop all these sound effects. And so I always had that in the back of my mind during that time period down there. And as I became a senior in college, I bought two things. I bought a book on how to get a job in radio, how to study, how to write news, how to write commercials, how to deliver. And I subscribed to Broadcasting Magazine, which is the Bible of the industry. And right near the end of my senior year, I started going through and seeing who wanted jobs and applied, made I don't know how many audition tapes right there in my own mobile home that I lived in, a little trailer, and sent one of them to WEAV in Plattsburgh, and that's where the radio business started when they responded.
The Bissell's were the first to hire you?
George Bissell Sr. I carried. McKay found the other day a copy of the telegram he sent me addressed to Warden, W-A-R-D-E-N, Warden Little, Kirschbaum's Trailer Park, East Northport, Long Island, saying being here at a certain time the next day for an audition.
So this Warden Little didn't get this telegram, and you ended up getting
I
it.
ended up with it, yeah, and I said, oh boy, here I am in trouble. I didn't have enough money for a bus ticket. It was, I think, $18.75 on Greyhound round trip back in those days. But we scrounged the piggy banks and did the bit, got a bus ticket, made it. The Greyhound bus stop was at the old Cumberland Hotel. Warden Little. That's what it said, Warden Little. Yeah, I said that. Kay's got cue cards. She is amazing. We're going to get you before we leave here today.
This is being taped in front of a live audience.
Yeah, live audience.
And a sleeping dog.
And a sleeping dog. Let sleeping dogs lie. Because he'll lick your leg.
Yeah, he washed my shoe during our last segment.
But the Greyhound bus stop was at the Cumberland. Remember, down at the corner? Stopped there, got out. Of course, WEAV was located on Court Street in Plattsburgh in those days, and they weren't open for business. They were, they were only on the air during the morning until evening, and then they signed off the air. So I stayed there and drank coffee and read the Press Republican newspaper for the rest of that night, walked over, did the audition tape, and was hired, and worked extremely hard, 65 hours a week for $53. And I was fired after, so that's the only time I've ever been fired from a job in my life. George Bissell Sr. fired me and told me I'd never amount to anything in radio.
That's been a very perceptive person.
He was a hard-nosed guy. His first radio station, I understand, was WENT 1340 in Gloversville, New York, where Scott Dustin, who replaced me as news director at WIRY, went to work after he left. So, but I didn't have a very distinguished career in radio after I left Weave. I went to Wiry and worked there for 35 and a half years, but enjoyed just being a part of the community. No great class in the effort, just a lot of hard work and a real need to connect with people,
Now, if you want to hear about Gordie's exploits, along with a few other radio personalities, we have that great tape we did. Another one we didn't think of earlier that's got to be one of your favorites.
Oh,
that we did this year with
Art Pierce, Chet Bosworth, and Bird Burdan, and Gordie Little. What a combination of these. Talk about having no trouble filling a 2-hour tape when these guys get going. And I have to say, it's very important to do that, because that is a tremendous part of North Country history and broadcasting, because you covered the two media, television and radio, at the same time, because Chet and Bird both worked simultaneously at television and radio in those days. And Art Pierce has since had some tremendous physical, mental setbacks. Had a quadruple bypass in Burlington, and we didn't know if he was ever going to get out of bed for months, but somebody told me he was walking around town the other day and getting back to his old self. As a matter of fact, sitting here in this living room last night was a name that some of our viewers might be familiar with, Roy Urbanus. His mother ran Carmen's Grocery on Elizabeth Street in Plattsburgh for years. He worked as a teenager in radio at both radio stations for a long, long time back in the old days when we had the sesquicentennial celebration for Plattsburgh in 1964. He recorded on disc the history of the Battle of Plattsburgh with the sounds, and it's marvelous even by today's standards. So he does recording, he has a production studio and has an advertising agency in Texas, but still comes back to see his mom at least once a year, and we sit down and you talk about old times. We were recalling things neither one of us had thought about for 35 years. So
Should have had a camera here last
we
night.
should have had a camera. Those friendships are wonderful.
And after we did that story with those three legends of local radio, this past summer we lost a legend that we didn't include because the guy was only 58 years old. He wasn't old enough to...
Much too young. Much too young. And if Ben had been there, that would have been another story. Charlie Stone did do a nice tribute to Ben on the radio, and I contributed a small bit, and Chet did, and some of the other people, which was very nice. But it's just, as our good friend Bob Vinn, it's not fair when the good die young.
Yeah. Now, when I was reading Ben's obituary, it certainly brought to mind stuff happening in that early 60s with some major recording stars coming to town, and you were part of that. Tell us about that.
This was, they talk about the 40s being the golden age of radio before television came along, but that golden age was still shining brightly after I got into radio. And once again, it was just by design from the good Lord that I would start my official radio career in 1961. I forgot to mention to you that back in high school in Moira, I did a weekly program on WICY, the hometown radio station in Malone, with sports scores and stuff. We were called the Moira Tigers. Incidentally, Roy Urbina said he did a show in high school here called the Orange and Black, the same kind of television or radio show. Our colors were the same, orange and black, but we were the Tigers and they were the Hornets. But we did that little show, and Don Pay, who was a wonderful old dean of broadcasting in the Malone area for almost 50 years, as Chet Bosworth was here in radio, said, "Gordie, you want to think about the radio business." And now that you mentioned that, maybe that's where the germ was first blossomed a little bit in high school.
And of course, I can't let Chet Bosworth's name go by without mentioning that my first television appearance was with Chet Bosworth on Bar 5 Ranch Time back in 1955 when I turned 8 years old. No, I didn't have no photos of that, but there is photos of Bar 5 Ranch Time, though.
That was great. But the 60s were wonderful because, we had a guy by the name of Ray Bushy who built a place called Rollerland. That it became many things since and burned down once and became a Teamster Hall and off Boynton Avenue in Plattsburgh. And Ray Bushy was a good promoter. And he was able to get many acts here on their way to Montreal. They'd want to fine-tune their material. Big stars, Linda Scott, Johnny Tillotson, many others. Brian Hyland, Tommy Rowe. I mean, you go on and on and on in groups and rock and roll stars. The biggest of the day would stop here and do a show, maybe charge $500, Today, you couldn't touch them for $50,000, but they come here. The beauty for me was it helped me to hone my skills of communication because I would get these people in the studio that day, do interviews with them. Got tape recordings with, Mitch Miller and all the big-time stars, and then we would get a chance to go and MC their shows at Rollerland at night and have the twist contests and the whole thing. So that was a delicious time. It's where I also learned to do remote broadcasts. Radio did a lot of live shows, not only at Rollerland, but right in downtown Plattsburgh. You'd have block dances and thousands of people would come. And what a great way to learn the radio business. So, those 60s were a great era. That's the time when the famous street drives began. We were one of the first in the nation to have street drives of that nature. The March of Dimes had never tried anything like that before. And we thought, well, let's have a mile of dimes. Can you imagine? We'd sit there and talk for 12 hours at a time and get people to give, and people always did. How many times have you seen it where we bought ambulances for fire stations and helped people in the various health agencies, from cystic fibrosis to muscular dystrophy and all the way down the line, and that continued right to the end with that wonderful drive for April LaValle, as you know. But that was a golden age, I thought, in radio because it was a great experience. And to have that sesquicentennial in 1964 and have Louis Armstrong, the man I revered more than my closest relatives, to come to town and be able to be on the same stage with the guy, well, the rest of my career was gravy after
And downhill since then.
Gravy after that, yeah.
Yeah, and I just found out last week that you were a trombone player there. So being a horn player, you must have been really.
Bob Morgan, we ought to get together and do a duet. We're talking about other times when my mother would leave the place when my slide would fall off the trombone, and I can't imagine how anybody could raise a kid like me.
Now, your radio career came to end in 96 or 97?
April of 1997.
97, that's right.
And left the business, and in those days didn't have any idea what I was going to do.
Well, before we mention that, you mentioned April LaValle, and that was the fall of 96, and that was probably the last big fundraiser you were involved with.
Right around Halloween.
But how the community responded to that little girl, and sad ending, but
very sad ending because she died, and Roger Senecal died. That was another drive that we had done before, but you know what? Their souls of those beautiful little angels linger on, because I'm involved proudly with a group called the CVPH Medical Center Foundation, which manipulates these funds in such a manner that other children can be helped. All these funds, dedicated funds, to help certain people who have to go to Burlington, have to travel, or have certain expenses that couldn't be covered any other way. And this foundation works very hard in many ways in the community with a lot of programs like Heart Smart and anti-smoking campaigns, and now a whole series of tremendous health-related programs on Channel 57, Mountain Lake Public Television in the area. But these funds, the Roger Senecal Fund and the April LaValle Fund, are there, along with several other dedicated funds now that will help people for a long, long time. So the people who gave to those funds don't have to stop. They can give directly to the foundation. I'm glad for the opportunity to promote them because they do an awful lot of good in the community.
And I think the whole community was so impressed with how you were able to keep such a positive attitude with little April. And so many of us were expecting the worst, but you always gave her hope. And
she gave me hope. You've already mentioned in this program several times how that comes back to you. And my life, I'll try not to cry now, but my life was tremendously enriched by that little girl and her family. And when people, when her family gave me and my wife a pen with a little angel on it after she died, those are your treasured experiences. To have that little girl in that drive in that tent behind the radio station, and to see the pictures of her all bundled up with that little tiny face, to see the poetry that she wrote for her other friends in school, to realize that she was in rough physical shape for almost all of her life, and yet she was a part of the whole thing. To have her mother give me a copy of her yearbook after she graduated from high school, after she expired, and to have her hand that to me. Those are the things. To have her mother stand up on stage during that Gordie Little Day they were kind enough to give me down on the steps of the government center, and to have her mother stand up and give a speech knowing that this woman, did not ever have a formal education, and who thought enough to write a speech to give to me that day. Those are the things that count. And to have these family members still call me on the phone and send cards to me, and to be able to go up there and plant a tree for her outside the school she attended. Boy, to see a growing thing. That life goes on. I mean, those of us, you talked about religion before being a very personal thing. I can't imagine not believing that life goes on after we're gone from here. That spirit lingers on in so many different ways. And the spirit of that little girl and others that have preceded her, and for many of the drives that we did, are what enrich me. I think those young kids and adults are a big part of who I am today.
And talking about this brings back among my archives and videotapes, I have a lot of these 6th grade graduations starting in 1986, and and continuing. And when the senior class at Northeastern graduates, in addition to showing them their senior year, I always pull out their 6th grade graduation, and now I'm able to pull out their kindergarten graduation because we go back that far. But when April's class was graduating, and I pulled out the tape of Moore's Elementary, there she was, a frail 6th grader giving one of the commencement speeches at her 6th grade class, and it was very moving for me at that time to pull out that
tape.
tape.
It's hard for us to understand why families and people are allowed to suffer that kind of pain, but we don't know the whole picture. But what we do know is what the effect of a person like that is. In her very few years she was allowed to stay on Earth, she affected many people in a profound way. When you see, they talk about the hardened reporters in the media. I was never very hardened, I'm afraid, and I'm proud to say that. But some of the other reporters who stand there and they're trying to film this little girl talking, and you see the tears running down their face, you know that she was able to touch people and hopefully change some people's lives, and certainly made a lot of people realize how important it is, as you said, to give back.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the end of your radio career. And that day, the Gordie Little Day, the county decreed that for the first and only time ever, the county was going to honor a person. This was after you left the radio station. And I was looking forward to being there, to videotaping that entire day.
But guess what else? Another one of our friends died.
And on June 27th of that year, Bob Venn, who did 500 of these shows called What's Going On Here, he died within 24 hours after doing a program just down the road here at the Clinton County Fair, a preview of the county fair every year with Bill LePage. So instead of me being at Gordie Little Day videotaping it, I was at Bob Venn's funeral that Saturday.
It was, talk about bittersweet experiences. It was a horrible thing that he died so young, but what a legacy. Not just the 500 shows he did, as if that weren't a significant part of his life and yours, but the man touched everybody he had contact with. Mm-hmm. He was an amazing personality, and I hear it everywhere I go.
You never met a stranger. You just
candy for the kids. What was it, candy or gum?
Gum. He was the gum
for
man.
The kids.
Yeah. You never met a stranger. When he'd meet somebody, by the time he got done with them, they had a friend.
There were a lot of differences between Bob Venn and myself, and as I said, the very first show we did, I never would even surmise that I could fill his shoes. But the guy was amazing. When he met you, he could remember your names and your family's names, and I can't remember the names of half of my own kids. And when we do this program, Calvin has to prompt me before the microphone goes on, or I could never get it through. But he was truly amazing.
Actually, Bob would remember the family my names better than he would.
Would he really?
Yeah, he'd say, "Oh yeah, I know your grandfather and you're the old trading Tomcats 50 years ago," that type of deal. Yeah, he'd always try to find that link too. If you were from a certain town, he always wanted to know somebody from that town, and he always managed to come up with somebody to tie it in. So with Bob gone and Gordie very much in the limelight right there, the obvious occurred to me. Who better to grab the reins from the What's Going On Here show than Gordie Little? And with Gordie's reputation, I thought this show should not just be a Northern Tier show, but should go beyond there. And we've tried to make our little corner a tri-county show, and we're hoping to do even more of that and expand it even more in the coming year.
Thank God for the county fairs, huh? That gets us to all three counties, all by itself. The ice storm took us all around. The Lumberman's Field Days in Tupper Lake took us down there, and we've been to Essex County a number of times. And yeah, who knows where we're going to go next time, right?
That's right. So we're going to close off right here. We're going to come right back, and maybe we'll have Kay here, and we'll put an end to this program. All right, Judy has motioned to start talking.
She protesteth too much. But it's very hard to get this lady out of the kitchen or in front of any camera, and I've seen her shy away from still photographs. So to get her on real television is a made you know this is a milestone. So you didn't hear any kicking and shouting in the background, but there were protests. This is kind of neat.
Yeah, so you showed us that off camera.
That's a piece of the Hindenburg. Kay and I love collectibles, and she collects bears and many things, and I collect, like Bob Venn, just about anything that isn't nailed down is in a drawer somewhere in this
Kitchen
house.
sinks?
Kitchen sinks. But on May 8th, 1937, the Hindenburg burned, as you know. A number of people were killed, and my dad was doing a evangelistic service right near Lakehurst, New Jersey, and one of the guys in the church came in the next day and said, "Hey, I picked up a few pieces of that thing that burned last night. You want one?" My dad took this piece, and it became a desk, a regular item on his desk all those years, and he kept this photograph of the Hindenburg from the news, pasted on this card right next to it so everybody would know what it was all those years, and his handwriting is still on this piece of the Hindenburg. So what a nice thing to own and to remember about your dad, huh?
Now, you said that you've heard of several people who have part of the skin from the Hindenburg?
Yes, but very few people have any pieces of wood that I've been able to locate. I tried to get on the internet, but I didn't. I just spent one day on it. When we were on vacation, some guy sent us a little email saying $500 for your piece of the Hindenburg sight unseen. So, if he never saw it and he wants it for $500, somebody else would love it for more. But I promised my dad I would keep it, and keep it I will.
Now, it's got to be we think of people today going out and scavenging like that, but to go out there at this disaster and to
pick up a piece of it.
It just,
Well, I think they knew, because this thing was huge. This thing was 200 feet longer than 2 football fields. Think about it. Almost 900 feet long, 800 and some feet long. It was just a monstrous thing. It had already made 10 highly heralded trips across the ocean in the previous year. Who would ever guess that it would burn or blow up and be the subject of controversy still after all of these years? But it was a big deal then, and we have all heard the broadcast, the humanity. So people who worked there knew it was a big deal in those days. I mean, it wasn't nearly the biggest airline disaster. There were only like 38 people killed in that, but it was still very, very spectacular. It was the first ever live radio broadcast, remote broadcast of its time, even though it was recorded. The networks didn't get a handle on that story until later that night and the next morning, amazingly. So this guy knew, and my dad always had a tremendous sense of history, so he knew this was very significant.
And there's newsreel footage of it. You look at the the Titanic. There's old footage, but not footage of the Titanic going down. Here's actual footage of this disaster. So this was early recorded history as far as film and so on.
As a matter of fact, my kids gave me a book. I'd like to grab it just to show it. Not that I'm promoting the book, except what a wonderful thing to give an ex-newsman, a book called We Interrupt This Broadcast. Not only with a great photograph, starting with the Hindenburg and ending with the tragic death of Princess Diana, but with 2 CDs with all those words on there, from Walter Cronkite to all the announcers, from all the significant events in your lifetime and my lifetime, because the Hindenburg went down, just as I told you, just very few weeks before I was born in 1937. So this is part of my life. So that was kind of among all the other wonderful gifts that our kids gave us, that's kind of a neat thing to have.
Now, Kay, what's it been like all these years being married to a legend?
Don't tell the truth. Whatever you do, don't tell the truth.
Please don't make me talk.
Okay, we won't make Kay talk. But Gordie, you were honored. You were honored at Gordie Little Day by a.
You'll never let me live it down. This is a first and maybe a last.
Well, I can imagine that when you're living with Gordie Little, you probably don't get a lot of chance to talk. You have to listen a lot. Is that true?
Believe
Just
me.
nod your head. Yeah.
She not only do I listen when she talks, but she beats the living bejeepers out of me in Scrabble. I told you last night by about 200 points. She lets me win about every third time. She lets me win. Anyway, we've had a wonderful life together. My life, I never could have survived all the not so good things that happened in my life up until we were married if it hadn't been for her and for this wonderful family that took me in. A great life.
I wanted to get into the awards. We can't cover them all, but
Oh, yeah,
well,
she's leaving, boy. That's it.
You're excused.
She'll fake something like time for lunch or time to let the dog
Well, she's
out
been
or-
looking for that picture of you as a rodeo star there. And
Well,
she's,
I was never much of a star at anything, but
you were honored with a lot of recognition that day, and over the years, you've received a lot of plaques and awards. And I know in the
They're all
kitchen you
special.
showed us a nice big one you received from Plattsburgh
the
State.
Distinguished Service Award. It's an honor. You know, I've been invited to dinners and banquets by fire departments, by civic organizations and groups, and by larger organizations, and have been favored with their recognition. And it's not something I may have deserved, but it's certainly something I've always cherished, to be able to help somebody in some way today. If we all lived by that credo, I think we'd have a better world, don't you?
I agree wholeheartedly. And you were surprised at least one time, weren't you?
Oh, that Irishman of the Year award. Well, that's called the sandbag method. When they get you there, and because you have to broadcast live, and then they make you the Irishman of the Year while you're doing that, and you cry in front of God and your whole country. What you talk about surprises being on the other end. You know, I've surprised a few people with other things through the years, but to have the tables turned on you. But it's fun. It's this great North Country we live in. As we've said at the beginning of the program, and we'll say at the end, wonderful place to live and raise a family. I can't imagine living anywhere else.
And with that, we're going to put an end to this program. We hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more. A lot of this stuff we've covered in bits and pieces through the year and a half that we've been doing this show. But we've pieced it all together in one little capsule here, and it's now a part of the history of Gordie Little.
And who knows where we're going to be next time for our little corner.